I'm Nina Munteanu, and welcome to this lecture series on writing fiction. Let's get started. This presentation and discussion explores and interprets the subgenre mundane science fiction and how the use of memoir achieves powerful impact by establishing relatable and mundane realism. The talk explores why this particularly works well in near future speculative fiction, using, among others, the example of my eco-novel, A Diary in the Age of Water. The use of mundane realism through setting and events, particularly through letters or diary, creates powerful narrative that uniquely engages the reader with metaphor, allegory, and archetypes through additional sensibilities and personal connections. Devices such as POV, tense, and voice are discussed, as well as disadvantages and caveats of this form of storytelling. Let's start with what a diary is. A diary is a first-person account of real events, relevant and meaningful to that person's life experience. It's written in casual conversational language, and it usually follows a chronological account of daily life over a lifetime. It has wide scope and is therefore autobiographical. If the scope is more narrow and focused, if it's based on theme, then it's a memoir, such as the theme could be addiction, loss, parenting, and it's usually written in scenes. Memoirs will trade accuracy for dramatic effect, using emotional truth over historical truth, for instance. If it's focused by topic, then it's a journal. For instance, a nature journal, a grief journal, travel journal. Here are some examples of well-known diaries. We all know Anne Frank's experience. Her diary is a mundane account of her tragic short life. Yoko Ono experienced Hiroshima during World War II. Henry David Thoreau's journal became a manifesto for living simply with nature. Sister Gargi's journal was an ode to a spiritual movement. The play of nonfiction in fiction is achieved through several tools. This includes use of point of view, such as first person or second person, writing as an epistolary novel or a series of letters, such as The Color Purple, using displaced narrative, such as The Great Gatsby, or a detached autobiography, such as To Kill a Mockingbird, or using interior monologue, such as Finnegan's Wake. Fictional diaries play on historical truth with emotional truth through narrator voice and use of metaphor. This provides authenticity, meaning, relevance, and particularly impact to the story. Reality and fiction blur through a realized premise that provides a gritty realism to the dramatization and intensifies the experience. The diary's ability to introspect provides great insight for the reader to the protagonist's inner voice, their eccentricities and self-delusions. These provide an intimacy with the character. Most fictional diaries are memoir-like because they're usually based on theme. This carries the meaning of the story. In the Poisonwood Bible, Barbara Kingsolver effectively uses several first-person voices, that of the mother and her 4 daughters, to provide more perspectives of the story. Mundane science fiction is a niche literary movement from 2004, focused on near future realism. It's also called speculative fiction or literary SF. The focus is on already existing technology and plausible extensions, no ray guns, warp drives, or time travel. The premise lies in existing circumstances and events. It has similarities with hard science fiction, cyberpunk, ecopunk, ecofiction, and climate fiction. Mundane science fiction incorporates elements of literary fiction and mainstream fiction to achieve a strong sense of realism. It is essentially the literature of near-future realism that explores how environmental and technological changes will change our lives. Christopher Kokonos calls mundane science fiction the science fiction that functions more as compass than chimera. Examples include cautionary tales and dystopias, all predicated on and launched from real events and phenomena. And this includes my own recent science fiction, climate fiction, A Diary in the Age of Water. A Diary in the Age of Water is a climate-induced journey of humanity through 4 generations of women, each with a unique relationship to water. Centuries from now, in a dying boreal forest in what used to be northern Canada, Keo, a young acolyte called to service in the Exodus, yearns for Earth's past. The age of water, before the water twins destroyed humanity. Looking for answers and plagued by vivid dreams of this Holocaust, Keo discovers the diary of Lina, a limnologist from a time just prior to the destruction. The diary spans a 40-year period in the mid-21st century and describes a planet in the grips of severe water scarcity. Lina, in her work for an international utility that controls everything to do with water, witnesses and records in her diary the disturbing events that will soon lead to humanity's demise. The story begins and ends in the far future with the blue being, Keo, who finds the diary of the limnologist, Lina. The story is obviously hard science fiction with a strong basis in science. This is obvious through the narrator, who is a scientist, and the form of the diary itself, in which each entry has an epigraph from a science textbook related to the experience in the entry. Lina also includes sketches, formulas, and other references to science. The fictionalized diary is a first-person narrative nested within a larger third-person narrative. Its setting is based on many real events, with dramatized fiction stitched in. This blurs what's real and what's fiction. Voice and POV are used to achieve differing scope and time perspectives between the diarist's world and that of the future being. We get insight into the inner voice of the diarist through first-person voice. This is contrasted with the third-person voice of the future being, who remains on the outside looking in. The plot is essentially that of a young future human in discovery, a metaphoric coming of age for humanity. The diary format includes the use of short entries with epigraphs, quotes from fact. Conversational voice of intimacy with introspection, opinion, and judgment. It includes the protagonist's outer conflict with family and colleagues, and her inner conflict with motivations and truths. There's metaphoric connections with water, and illustrations are embedded in the diary entries. Here are some examples of Lina's sketches in her diary. And here is one of the formulas and a science quote at the beginning of a diary entry that both ground the reader into the science and the mind of the scientist. The diarist is a real and flawed protagonist. This makes her more like us, and we are more likely to empathize with her despite her considerable flaws. Lena makes mistakes and does some terrible things, but the diary allows the reader to find out more about why she does these things, what motivated her, and how she feels, including remorse and regret. This allows the reader to forgive Lena, even as her own daughter cannot, even as she cannot. This becomes key to the story, which is about forgiveness. The diary abruptly ends with pages torn out, and Kyo is anxious to know what happened to both Lena and her world. So is the reader. Readers and reviewers had interesting responses, some paradoxical, scary and comforting at the same time, a beautiful and alarming tale. This novel made my heart clench. There were times when I was afraid to keep reading. A gripping novel that was impossible to put down. The story, like water itself, fills you, moves you, hypnotizes you, and eventually totally engulfs you. In their analysis, reviewers gave these visceral responses. The use of diary entries provides much needed intimacy in a stark world, enhanced by the illustrations and definitions. Truth and fiction combine perfectly in this story that takes readers on a sensational and educational journey. Fact and fiction merge flawlessly in this story that takes readers on a dramatic and eye-opening voyage. This story works as both literature and persuasion. Poetic prose with sober, factual basis. Avery Karashi at Event Magazine called The Diary and Age Water ambitious. Ursula Flug in Horizons called the book a bit of a hybrid and the author a risk taker. Buried in Print, who state that this book will not suit every reader, says this: ultimately, the book exists in an in-between place, some mystical elements of the generational tale possibly alienating the dedicated sciencey readers, and the instructional elements possibly alienating fiction devotees. And yet, I read on, strangely compelling. So why do readers read on? That blur with reality makes readers both love and hate the novel, and it is precisely this that makes them read on. They are thoroughly invested. They need to know how it turns out, as though this is real lives at stake. I've provided some references for mundane science fiction and ecofiction here. And many thank yous for listening. So this makes the use of diary an effective device in compelling mundane science fiction. I hope you enjoy the talk. Thanks for coming. Bye for now.